Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani. I am the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices through civic and interfaith engagement. You're with us today because we're in our third part of our series of our candidate Q&A, where we get together with candidates on federal, state, and local elections to talk about issues that are relevant to the Muslim and to the multi-faith community. These are issues that range from Islamophobia to climate change to also the situation of children at the border. Today, we are joined by our special guest, Jay Sittleburg, who is running for Senate District 4. If you have a chance to look at the expanse and maybe the diversity of Senate District 4, it runs very wide across many areas. We're also joined with Imam and Dr. Rahabi Muhammad of Woodlands Islamic Center. Thank you, Dr. Rahabi, for joining us today. Dr. Rahabi's mosque, Woodlands Islamic Center, is also in Mr. Sittleburg's district, which is, again, Senate District 4. Thank you for joining us, Jay.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So there has been, we've gone through your campaign website, and you have a very interesting platform that reaches out across the aisle. Could you tell us a little bit more about your platform?
Yeah, sure. Look, I've lived, I'll just do it in a way of telling you why I'm running for this seat to begin with, because
Sure.
I think that will cover why I'm doing it and what my platform is. So I moved to Texas 13 years ago when I got out of the military. I served in the military for many years. And when I left the military, I moved to Houston for a job in the oil and gas industry, which is what I currently do as a project manager. And in that 13 years that I've lived in Texas, here's what I've witnessed. We're at the bottom in public education in the country. We're at the top in property tax burden in the country. We're number one in the number of rural healthcare clinics and hospitals that have closed their doors in this country. We're number one in the country in the number of uninsured citizens we have living in the state of Texas. And we continue to have flooding event after flooding event after flooding event, especially many that impact Senate District 4. And to this day, we still have no robust flood mitigation policy or plans to speak of that can help protect everyday hardworking Texans. And so that is why I decided to run for this seat, because quite frankly, we need to elect legislators to Austin that are willing to expand Medicaid in the state of Texas, certainly as a start to help our uninsured population that exists here, which is over 4.5 million Texans. And we need to close loopholes in our tax laws that continue to give billions and billions of dollars of giveaways to corporations every year on the back of hardworking Texans. And we wonder why our property taxes are so high when we continually give these corporations these tax breaks that everybody in Austin knows exists, and no one has the moral or political courage to put legislation on the floor to close it. And we passed some flood mitigation policy in 2019, which is great. We created some pots of money for it that the legislation doesn't control, by the way. But the plan for flood mitigation isn't due till like 2024. Well, that's not helping people today. And it's not going to help people for the next few years if it's not due till 2024. We have to do better for people, because these storms are becoming more aggressive and they happen more often. And they're certainly being more stronger in nature, which speaks to what's going on in our climate in this world. And we have to address those issues when we want to move forward. So that is the main points in my platform. Now, I know there are so many other things that people have issues with, and some of those may or may not be the issues that affect you. But I find in a broad perspective, those particular issues impact so many people in Senate District 4, along with so many others. I know mental health and suicide prevention is also on the top of my list. I serve on the Montgomery County Behavioral Health and Suicide Prevention Task Force, and I sit on 2 of their work groups, the adult and pediatric suicide prevention work groups, and I'm the LBGTQ and veteran outreach lead for those groups. And we're really trying to, number one, just end suicide and obviously end the stigma that's associated with mental health, so that these need to become normal dinner table conversations that we have, because that's the way we're going to help fix things. And we have to make sure from every level of government that we're putting money into resources so that we can get these people help, because so many issues impact in everybody's life. I challenge anybody that's listening to this to not have some part of your life that's not impacted with somebody who suffers from either mental health or a suicide ideology, or unfortunately attempt or completion.
Absolutely. And I'm sure Imam Rahabi counsels people all the time, and maybe even more because of COVID. We've all been cooped up here. I might need a little bit of counseling myself. My wife's been getting on my nerves lately, but she's awesome. It's just finding a way to get through this and making sure we come out better for it instead of worse off. And I think that's the challenge that we all have to come together to find. And we're seeing evictions, or the process of evictions that are happening in our state, in our city, in the greater Houston area, that are of absolute concern. Councilmember Letitia Plummer of Houston, she published an op-ed in the Chronicle yesterday that's really created some waves in the community, in the larger community, bringing attention to what's going on. Because when the CDC moratorium ends in December and starting January, we're going to have problems. And so you're talking mental health, we're talking evictions, we're talking family separation, because families might have to separate to be able to live and have shelter over their head. There's so many issues that come with this. And leadership is at the center core of it. Leadership is at the center core of it. So Jay, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump right in with some of the questions.
Yeah.
And the first one is the first one is of this issue of evictions. If you were to be elected in Senate District 4, what would you do to help out those who are underprivileged, and maybe ensuring that the eviction process is easier, it's more transparent? But on the same token, what would you do to ensure that landlords, that their rights are also respected? Because it's a balancing act that we have to maintain. We can't just help people who are just underprivileged without recognizing that these landlords haven't had rent paid for maybe 6, 7, 8, possibility of 12 months once the eviction process is all said and done.
Yeah, these are great questions, and certainly in this time of COVID, it exacerbates it, right? I mean, I think there's always been issues with the eviction process anywhere. I'm not just going to point it towards the state of Texas. But when we look at this issue in a broader perspective, you're absolutely right. When we look at the shutdowns that occurred, the loss of jobs, the loss of employment that has occurred across the country, I mean, this conversation isn't certainly centric to Texas by any stretch of the imagination. And if we look at the impacts of that, 40% of the country doesn't have $400 put away for some emergency that may happen, right? So now imagine you're one of those folks and you worked 1 or 2 jobs to keep a roof over your head and food on the table, and now those jobs went away and you have no income and you have no savings. So how do you do that? For a reason that you had nothing to do with. It's not your fault. You absolutely had nothing to do with it. Well, number one, obviously, the first thing that has to happen is we have to have a federal government that puts together these packages and passes them through the Congress to help supply money to these issues, quite frankly. Because the one thing I will say is that states can do a certain amount, but states cannot print money. States cannot create money that doesn't exist from the revenues that they receive to be able to put their budgets together. That's true for the state. It's true for any municipality or any county. But the federal government has the ability to do a little bit more, quite a bit more than state and local governments do. So that's why these COVID packages that the Congress has passed have been so vital for especially this type of issue, because we can't just say we're going to help those families that now don't have a job. We have to understand that there's a chain that goes on here. When a renter can't pay their rent, that means the landlord is not receiving revenue to be able to pay the bills they need to pay to keep that building moving forward.
Right.
And when they can't pay to keep that building moving forward, then there's somebody else down the stream that's not receiving money. And it's an ever-ending snowball chain, right? So this is why these moratoriums are so important. And this is why we have to try to find, the funds and the resources and have programs that will allow these folks to have some kind of call it moratorium, but we need to make sure we're taking care of everybody throughout that chain of command. And I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you I know all the answers of how to do that. But the first thing I do know is that the one thing that's going to help us tremendously with this issue is to be able to actually get to a point in our country and in our state that we can actually really start opening things up and getting things moving again. I think that is the most important part of this. Yes, in the short term, we need to take care of these folks that can't afford the rent, the landlords that aren't receiving the rent, to make sure that people remain whole and aren't put on the street, which creates even more problems. But at the end of the day, we can do that, and it obviously is in the short term. But in the long term, we need to have a common message that's coming across from every level of leader within this country, whether it's the federal level to the state level to the local level, on how we're going to get through this. That means we need to follow the guidelines. We need to wear our face masks and social distance and wash our hands and limit our exposure to large groups, especially indoors, and have testing and tracing available at no cost to people so that we can identify hotspots and squash them as quickly as possible, so that we can continue to move along until obviously someday this vaccine will come along. I'm not going to tell you when it's going to be because I have no idea when it's going to be.
You don't have the answer.
I don't. It's amazing. But the reality is all these things need to work together to try to make this work. So, I understand that might not be the most clear answer on the specific question about these evictions. But at the end of the day, the federal government and the states need to work together. And it's hard in the state of Texas, right? I mean, they can do so much, but the legislation is not in session, 365 days a year. Right. They only meet for 5 months every 2 years.
Right.
And so no laws are made in between them. So, it can be, unless the governor calls a special session, which certainly has not happened at this point in time. So, we have to keep that in mind too, that we do rely a lot on the federal government, quite frankly, to especially provide these packages that provide money that can be distributed, because the state doesn't always necessarily have the resources available to it, especially if you're shutting everything down. Think about what's happening to the revenue that's coming into the state or your local government, quite frankly. It's significantly reduced because the majority of that is sales tax and those types of taxes. So
Jay, if you're to be elected, you'd be sworn in January, but that's right at the beginning of the Texas legislative session. So would you say evictions would be on your slate of priorities?
It would absolutely have to be, because it's not going to go away between now and then.
Because the CDC moratorium expires.
That's correct.
It's going to expire right at the beginning of your term, should you be elected.
That's correct.
Now, speaking of Texas legislative session in our state, our great state of Texas hosts ICE facilities that have contributed to family separation. We know of at least 2,600 immigrant children who are separated from their parents or caregivers, and they're being held in for-profit detention centers. These detention centers are making exorbitant amounts of money per head to keep these children in cages. And now we're hearing all this information coming about women who have received hysterectomies while being detained in ICE facilities. Now, we understand that ICE is part of the federal branch of government, right? And it's not, the state of Texas doesn't have, necessarily a direct purview or legislative authority against ICE or its endeavors. Yeah. But at a state level, the Texas Senate, Texas legislature does have the opportunity to impede, make life difficult, or at least step up and say this isn't something that we as Texans should be engaged in. I ask you directly, Jay, how do you plan to keep children out of cages, and what steps would you take to ensure that no one is making money off the trauma of children who have fled their countries, to find freedom here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and quite frankly, every American should be appalled by the practice of separating children from their families for no reason whatsoever, other than to separate children from their families. Look, I'm totally against private prisons. Our criminal justice system needs reform, like many other systems do. And one of our biggest problems with our criminal justice system is for-profit prisons. We put people in jail, and it's a money-making machine. Many people don't realize, maybe still don't realize, we have two for-profit prisons in Conroe, Texas, just up the street from me, and they're ICE facilities. They're run by the GEO Group, and they basically wanted to make Montgomery County the capital of their prison network in the state of Texas, and of course the local politicians are letting it happen because they put lots of money in their campaign accounts. So the bottom line is I will never support any type of policy legislation that separates children from their families. Number one, I think it should never happen to begin with. It should have never happened to begin with, and it's appalling. I mean, I don't know what else to say besides saying that it's not the way our immigration system should work. We need comprehensive immigration reform, and the state of Texas can have a little bit of say in that from a legislative perspective, but certainly this is a federal issue that comes into play with border protection and how border protection and immigration is handled. But at the end of the day, we all have to work together. If I get elected as an elected official, to make sure that policies are being put in place that are the right policies. And then the bottom line with immigration is we need an immigration system that's fair across the board and has enough resources in it to handle the volume of folks that come, whether it's seeking asylum or seeking a work visa or a student visa, whichever the case may be. Because we should be promoting legal immigration into this country, and we should want it, and we should want as many people to come here and contribute to our society as we can. People don't realize that immigrants provide billions and billions of dollars they spend in tax revenue that comes in. They have so much money that they contribute to the local economies. And if we look at the state of Texas, I mean, truthfully, in the state of Texas, of the immigrant population in the state of Texas, 67% of them are in the workforce. Only 64% of native-born people that live in Texas are in the workforce. So they're a higher portion of the workforce in Texas by percentage than native-borns are. So we have to understand that. We need to treat people like people. Humans are humans. Are there bad people that are illegal immigrants in this country? Yes. And of course they should, be punished for their crimes and be deported. But the majority of folks are not, and we shouldn't treat them as if they're criminals, because they're not. We should treat them like humans. We should have a system in place that doesn't necessarily put people in detention, but puts people into programs, whether it's monitoring programs, counseling programs, whatever we want to call them, to deal with them through the process until they can have a hearing in front of a judge, which should not take 2 years to get. So, I can tell you, I would do everything in my power as a state senator to make sure that these facilities that are doing this are brought to bear, that people know about them, and we shut them down.
Thank you. And to switch gears a little bit, talking about criminal justice reform. I serve on Mayor Turner's Police Reform Task Force. I'm one of the 45 members of the task force. And Chief Acevedo has said to us and said very publicly over and again that there is room for police reform. Now, defunding the police isn't something that we're having a conversation about. It's not something that I believe at all. I do believe that there is room for police reform, as you mentioned. Sometimes our systems are stuck 20, 30, 40 years ago in a continuously and rapidly evolving society, and that our laws and our policies have to keep up with the pace of change that's occurring in society, especially in regards to our communications flow. That's very important. Chief Acevedo and other police chiefs have gone on record to say that they believe, and it's not just Houston, we're talking Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, we're talking Amarillo, El Paso, chiefs in different cities throughout the state of Texas have said that they believe if an officer is fired from one municipality, that they should not be allowed to be rehired. Because in Texas, if the police officer is fired from one location, he or she can be rehired in another location, no matter the offense. No matter the offense, as long as their peace officer's license is intact, they can be rehired. Chief Acevedo and others have said that they disagree with this rule, that it's something that has to change at the state level. It's not something that they have the power to change. What they would like to see is if an officer is fired once, their peace officer license is pulled. Where do you fall on this issue? How would you respond to Chief Acevedo and the other chiefs in this regard?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially with the issues we've dealt with the police over the last several months, for sure, but certainly over for many years. And the bottom line is, I agree. And I agree that, obviously, I think there needs to be a certain definition of if somebody is fired, what that offense is, and what would then make them lose their peace license. I will say that. I just don't. I have a hard time, at least at the moment right now. Somebody can convince me otherwise, but at the moment I have a hard time just saying if they're fired for any reason, they lose their peace license, because I don't know that that is the correct answer to blanketly say that.
And we're not talking about removing support from our law enforcement officers, because they put their lives on the line day in and day out to support our communities and ensure our safety. We're talking about the bad apples.
Yeah, and certainly the bad apples. I mean, if you're fired for an offense as a peace officer that is, committing lying, purging to try to get a warrant, obviously a shooting that may occur that perhaps was unwarranted, or even just a assault, not necessarily a shooting, then I absolutely agree, right? We shouldn't let a bad apple go from point A to point B just because somebody's not able to check their background, because there's no way to check their background when it comes to that. That's part of, the reform that needs to happen. And let me be clear, I just heard you mention the defund the police thing, and I just want to quickly give my 2 cents on that. Number one, I don't think anyone should have ever started using the term defund the police, because that's not what that's talking about whatsoever. If you actually look at what it actually means, maybe they should have used something like reallocation of funds or something for the police. But at the end of the day, I want to make very clear, being a Democrat on this ticket, I want to make it very clear that, certainly me and any Democrat I know supports law enforcement. We never have not supported law enforcement. And we certainly understand if you put any group of people together, I don't care if it's policemen, firemen, priests, white people, black people, yellow people, I put any group of people in a category and there are bad apples in that group. And we have to get rid of those bad apples, especially when they have an impact like they do if they work in law enforcement. So we have to have reforms that talk about those things and can hold departments accountable, even though there's the majority of people are good cops. The majority of folks that work in departments are good. But there has to be a check and balance that goes along with it to make sure that the right things are being done. Because we all know without checks and balances, those things will change. You have to have them. And quite frankly, the community has to be involved in that, in my opinion, when it comes to that. But at the end of the day, to answer your question, I absolutely agree that offense has been committed by a law enforcement officer and they get fired, they should not be able to go to the next city and just pick up a job.
Absolutely. And let's speaking of law enforcement, there's an issue that's near and dear to us, which is Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, xenophobia, you name it, anything where there's an opportunity to discriminate or hate on minorities or people of color. And with that, I'd like to give the baton over to Imam Rahabi.
Okay, thank you, brother Mr. Shariq Abdul Ghani. Thank you so much for having me. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you and bless your efforts. And thank you, Jay. We pray for you God bless you and increase you in knowledge and in wisdom. And God bless you and your family as well. So I have one or two questions. As a faith leader, living with my Muslim community and worship places, in recent history, we hear you and all of us hear about some like Islamophobia or things that people attack masajid or families. So my question now, Mr. J, what would your first step be to combat Islamophobic rhetoric in legislation or in public?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and it's an important topic because look, we have seen the rhetoric that's gone on with people of color, different faith groups across the board, but we certainly have seen it profoundly aimed at the Muslim community. You know, people tend to get this misconception that Muslims are bad, no matter who they are, and it's obviously not true. It's just like anything else I've said. You know, any group has bad apples within it, but the majority of people in that group are not bad apples, and they are, they practice their religion the way they want to, and they're free to practice their religion the way they want to. That's what our Constitution says in this country. And they should not be discriminated against because they choose to practice their religion. And it's ridiculous for anybody to say that just because you're part of a certain religion, that you are a terrorist or you're a bad person just because of the religion that you decide to practice. And part of that has to be the messaging that comes from leadership. And we need to see our leaders, which we do to certainly a certain degree, but we certainly have to see our leaders support all of our ethnic and religious groups and faiths that exist. I mean, I'm a Christian. I go to church. I believe in God, and I have a great church that I attend, and I love the people that I'm around at that church, and that's what I choose to do. But I also know that for this particular job in public service, that I can love my church and everything else, but that my religious faith doesn't need to come into my decision-making process if I'm an elected official. What has to come into my decision-making process as an elected official is the data, the science, the feedback I get from constituents, and quite frankly, what makes sense for the majority of the people, and in this case, the majority of Texans that either live in Senate District 4 or in the state as a whole. So number one, we have to make sure we have leadership that promotes the right message when it comes to any ethnic or religious group that exists, and make sure that people understand the facts and science. So much of this is about education. And number two, we need to have anti-discrimination laws in the state, in the country. We have them to a certain degree. We have the Constitution, which apparently some people like to throw out the window when it comes to this particular topic, and I don't really understand why. But there's so many groups of people that are discriminated against for no other reason than, whether it's their religion or who they love or the color of their skin, or their gender for that matter. And it all needs to end. I mean, people need to treat each other like humans. We need to respect each other. I mean, that's what I do. I mean, I respect people and give people the benefit of the doubt until they give me a reason not to. But I don't prejudge it before I have a chance to know who they are. And so for me, it's about, again, we need anti-discrimination laws that specifically protect people in this state, because there are certain groups of people that certainly aren't protected in this state by laws. And we need to have a message that shows that we are all people and we should care about each other and let people live their lives, because quite frankly, it doesn't interfere with mine.
Sure. So if I can move to the other question,
Yes.
The last question, if you allow me. How would you use your position to ensure that hate crimes and Islamophobia are taken seriously and that justice is served? What do you believe to be the most important step to preventing hate crimes?
Yeah. So again, I think number one, I think it starts with messaging and education. You have to have it. We do have laws, right? We have hate crime laws on the books. And sometimes they can be hard to prosecute because you have to prove somebody actually has the intent because of certain reasons. And I do understand that. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, so much of this comes down to misinformation and uneducation is what this comes down to, and not interacting with our fellow Americans. Because if we actually sat down at the table and talked to each other in a civil manner, no matter if we're talking about different religious groups or if we're talking about different political affiliations, it doesn't really matter. If we sit down and have a rational conversation about topics and issues that affect us, kitchen table issues we talk about at home at the kitchen table, we'll find that we have so much more in common. And we need to promote that message, right? And anytime a hate crime or an act of assault or discrimination arrives, no matter who the involved parties are, or no matter which side is committing the crime, if I can put it that way, it needs to be denounced, right? I mean, I can tell you right now, if I saw a hate crime or an assault or a discrimination going on by a fellow Democrat, I would call it out in a heartbeat, because that's what we have to do. That is how we have a society that manages and weeds out our bad apples, is that we cannot tolerate it. We have to set a tone in the message that says it will not be tolerated no matter which side it comes from or no matter from whom it comes from. And if you commit a crime, you should be arrested and you should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law so that you get punished for the crime you committed. And I will certainly advocate for that every chance I could get.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much for your answer.
Dr. Abiy, is it okay if I switch gears a little bit?
Yes.
Excellent. Jay, moving over to, so we've talked about hate crimes, we've talked about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, the gamut, and let's move over to a little bit about diversity, because not having that diversity, not having that representation of diversity is sometimes what creates this miscommunication, and oftentimes bad policy, because people just don't know about the quote unquote other. We know Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the United States. I live in the most diverse county in the country, which is Fort Bend County. But diversity remains a talking point unless we see it reflected in our relationships and in our government. What would you do to ensure diversity in all aspects of your office, but in your policymaking as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things I've pledged to do if I get elected to this position is, number one, I think it's important that we have transparency between elected officials and the constituents that live in this particular case, the district. So I've certainly pledged that I would hold regular call them town halls throughout the district all the time, because if I vote on something, it's not going to be a secret of why I'm voting on something. And obviously, depending on the topics that come up at hand or at issue, I am never going to claim to be the expert on every issue that ever comes across the desk of an elected official. It's impossible to do that. So the only way that you can make sure you're making good, sound decisions is that leaders know that you have to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, that can help you answer these questions. And so for me, it's about having communication and outreach to every community that lives in the district, regardless. And that means, I understand that public service is not about me. Public service is about you and the constituents that live in the district. And I also understand that if I get elected, I'm not elected to represent the people that support me. I'm not elected to represent the people that voted for me. I'm elected to represent everyone that lives in the district, and everyone's voice matters. And that's why I'll say I'll do these town halls. I'll always have an open door policy. Anyone can come and talk to me about anything. We can disagree on policy issues. That is not the issue. I mean, if you bring facts and data to me on a certain issue that I have a certain stance on, and you change my mind, then so be it. You change my mind. The facts the facts and the data are not going to change. If I have something wrong, then I will change my mind, because I'll be like, well, I didn't look at it that way. And we have to be able to do that. We have to be able to compromise to get good legislation, whether it's out of the state legislation or U.S. Congress. You have to compromise to be able to get legislation that actually helps the majority of the people that live in an area that you're trying to represent. And so I am committed to those things. And I know that I would have a staff. I mean, obviously at the state Senate level, you don't have a huge staff because they don't have a lot of money to have a staff to begin with. But at the end of the day, it's all about communication skills and all about keeping in contact with all the different communities and faith groups within the district and even outside the district. Because again, a single senator in the state of Texas can get nothing done. You have to have allies, and you have to have allies both on your side of the aisle and the opposite side of the aisle. It's the only way it works, and works the way it's supposed to. And I'm committed to do that, because look, you know, everybody has a voice, and I was raised in a way that I respect every person and their opinion, unless they do something that gives me a reason not to, which is typically things like lying to me or doing something like that, right? So and we need to have that ability to have those conversations. And if we, at the end of the day, if we can't come to an agreement on something, then that's okay. It's okay not to agree on everything, because I guarantee I don't agree with every Democrat on every single issue. And I guarantee I agree with a lot of Republicans on many issues. I mean, that's how life works. We don't live in these little silos where, you know, it's my way or nothing, and I'm the only one that has an opinion. That's just simply not how life works. And I'm committed to make sure that everybody's input is heard, and that, you know, the decisions made or the votes that I would cast are cast in a manner that respects everybody that lives in the district, and they understand why I did it. And it's helping the community. Most importantly, it's helping the people that live in the district. Because again, I've told people, if I get elected, I have 4 years to make a difference. I have 4 years to do things. And in those 4 years, I'm going to do everything in my power to try to make the quality of life better in Senate District 4 and across the state of Texas. And I will not let a lobbyist come into my office and bully me around and try to tell me if I try to do something, I'll destroy your political career. Because the reality is, I'm not looking for a political career. I have a great career that I love in the oil and gas industry. I do this because I am committed to public service. It's a passion for public service, and I like to help people. And if at the end of that 4 years, people don't like what I do, then they don't have to vote for me again. If they do, they'll reelect me. It's as simple as that. You know, I'm not here to inflate my campaign account. I'm not here to put money in my pocket because of backdoor deals. That is not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I want to help people, and I want to be in a position that makes rational decisions. And I don't want to see another bathroom bill come across the legislature in the state of Texas, spending our time working on things that hardworking Texans worry about at the kitchen table. And I guarantee the bathroom bill is not one of them that we need to be dealing with.
Well, you answered my question by actually not only affirming your commitment to diversity. I love the open door policy, but also mentioning oil and gas, which brings us into the next set of questions, which is climate change. But before we get to climate change, I know Imam Rehabi has to get back to the mosque. He has duties to lead prayer. Thank you, Imam Rehabi. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
And if you have any other questions, please just send them my way. I'll be happy to answer them.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Jay. And again, I pray for you. God bless you and your efforts. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, to protect all of us and bless America. Thank you, brother, Mr. Sharif, for your efforts. Jazakallah khair, and see you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Islam. So, Jay, you know, you're very passionate about flood mitigation. And as we know, one of the main contributors to increased flooding is climate change. And there are various ways to mitigate the effects of climate change. You know, recently, one of my personal heroes, Prime Minister Ardern of New Zealand, stated by 2030, she just said this a couple of days ago, by the way. She said by 2030, New Zealand would be carbon neutral. Your district is heavily in oil and gas. But But this step of going carbon neutral by 2030 that New Zealand is doing, and I'm not saying we should do this in Texas or America, though it might be a good idea, but this step would help combat climate change, which in turn would create flood mitigation. What is one step you would take to make this a reality? And what types of climate change reform would you take into account?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm certainly not a denier of climate change that's going on in our world. Hey, look, the bottom line is I work in oil and gas. And my job in oil and gas is I consult owner operators on OSHA, EPA, and Department of Homeland Security regulatory compliance. That's what I do in my normal job. And the truth of the matter is, many and most, I'll say, of these oil and gas companies, especially the majors, they have continued with research and development on reducing carbon footprints through all of the last many years. It's not like they stopped doing anything because of anything that's happened at the national level or the federal level with, rolling back regulations. Because quite frankly, they're smart enough to know that they're going to come back when perhaps the current administration is not there anymore.
That's right.
So at the end of the day, we actually do a very good job in Texas with alternative energy. We produce a lot of wind energy in Texas. We produce a lot of solar energy in Texas. And what we have to recognize is we can all work together in this world of oil and gas, fossil fuels, if you will, and alternative energy, whether it be solar, whether it be wind, whatever the case may be. We can all work together to reduce the carbon footprint that's being put out by any organization. And we have to recognize that we need to make sure we have laws that are implementing that and moving forward. And I think we'll get in a better direction as we move along. But at the end,
so to be clear, as someone who believes in climate change, you're not talking about eradicating the oil and gas industry.
No,
you're talking about a transition.
Well, yes, because I mean, if we think about it, it's the only logical way that it's going to happen. You can't just shut down the oil and gas industry tomorrow and say, okay, you're gone, and we're going to use this alternative energy. That's just not how life works.
And we can't do that because we depend on oil and gas for so many things, such as plastics.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true, right? The fossil fuels go into so many different things, and people don't sometimes recognize that, I guess. But there has to be a transition period, and in that transition period, you foster relationships and you work across with alternative energies, and you transition from one place to another, certainly as technology moves along, right? Because that's been one of the biggest issues with alternative energy is the technology. Because a lot of time, if you look at wind energy, when it first really kind of came around, and even still today, quite frankly, it's use or lose energy because we don't have the technology to store that energy and use it at a later date. So It's use or lose. So obviously we need to advance that type of technology and research and development so that, when we get to the point that we can store large amounts of energy that's produced by these alternative means and then use it at a later time when it's needed, that's something that's missing right now in that particular part of the industry. So, we should always be doing this research and development. And yes, so we need to start doing those things because we can see climate change is doing what it's doing. And quite frankly, you talked about, the flooding issue and putting it in perspective, because obviously these storms are more severe and they're dropping more rain. They're larger storms. They have bigger impacts, whether it's on the coast or whether it's inland. Because if it's just like we saw, we just saw a storm in Florida and Alabama, Mississippi that dropped, 30 inches of rain because it was moving so slow. It wasn't necessarily the wind that was the biggest factor. It's the fact that you get 30 or 40 inches of rain. We saw in Houston what that does when we talk about Hurricane Harvey and what the impacts were with that storm and the amount of rain it dropped. So, and there's other aspects of flood mitigation that have to be addressed as well. So, it's also about responsible development. We have to understand that, deforestation makes a big impact on flooding that goes on because, every tree can soak up thousands and thousands of gallons of water. So when you cut down a field with hundreds of acres of trees, you now have, millions of gallons of water where is it going to go now? Because it's going to go somewhere. It just can't go where it used to, which is into the ground and into the trees.
It's going to go in people's homes.
It's going to go in people's homes, right? So, we have to make sure we have responsible development that's going on in these surrounding communities. I mean, because I'm impacted by that where I live. I mean, when I moved in my neighborhood, we never had flood issues at all. And in the last year and a half, every heavy rainfall and storm we get, I've had water almost in my house now, which was unheard of when I moved in my house. And it's all because of the development that's going on in the surrounding areas outside of our community, because it's diverting all that water into our community. So, these are all the issues that have to be addressed when it comes to this. And of course, climate change. I mean, everyone talks bad. There's a lot of people that talk down the Green New Deal and things of that nature. And I'm not saying everything in the Green New Deal is great or not great. And I'm not saying everything's necessarily doable. But the Green New Deal, quite honestly, is a 17 or 19 page document that's kind of a building block. It has no real, there's no directive in it. It's a building block of how to try to take action to protect our environment and protect the world that we live in, so that we don't disintegrate. I mean, we look at the West Coast right now. The entire West Coast of this country is on fire, and that's not happening because
that's not normal.
That's not normal.
Yeah.
And pardon me if I say raking the forest is not going to solve the issue.
Right.
So we have to take these things seriously, and we have to put policies and legislation in place that addresses them. And that doesn't mean that we have to take some drastic action. Like, we're not talking about at this point at all getting rid of the oil and gas industry or ending the oil and gas industry. What we're doing is talking about a partnership. And we're talking about building this together and moving forward so that we are protecting our environment and preserving our resources and our water and our food supply for future generations to enjoy long after that you and I are gone.
Yeah, it's not about removing X industry or Y industry. It's about how do we ensure that planet Earth is protected, that our children are taken care of, that future generations have the land and the ocean and everything they need to survive and thrive.
That's exactly right. And by doing those things, we're also going to find that we're going to create millions of jobs.
Right.
In doing so. And so, it's really, all these things come down to education. So many people just need some education on a lot of these issues, because there's so many issues that we can talk about. Not everybody can, has time to go research these things. And unfortunately, so many people just believe what they read on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, or maybe a snippet from 15 seconds of news, as opposed to seeing the full picture.
Right. Yeah. So switching gears over to our last question, which is about an issue that is important in our community, the Latino community, the Black community, the overall society, is a school to prison pipeline. In our education system. Over the last 15 years, schools in Texas started ticketing students upwards of $500 for truancy. Children. In some cases, teenagers are sent to adult jails because of their inability to pay these fines. And this event is part of the larger issue, which is the school to prison pipeline. What is one concrete step and or policy item you would take to combat this pipeline, and where is it on your list of priorities?
Yeah, so look, public education. So one of my top priorities in this campaign is public education funding, because the state does a dismal job of providing their portion of public education funding in the state of Texas. And I don't want anyone to think that 2019 is going to be the norm for the legislature in the state of Texas, where they actually did a decent job of funding public education. But quite honestly, the legislature's been stripping money out of public education for the last decade in the state of Texas, and they've done it unequivocally and unapologetically until people started getting in an uproar. Because look, in my opinion, we need to make sure the state is putting the appropriate amount of money into public education. We need to make sure that way we can reduce the property tax burden that we have as Texans, because if they're putting their share in, we can reduce the local level. And the biggest part of your property tax bill in Texas is going to your local ISDs. And when they don't get the right amount of money from the state, then they're going to increase your taxes and get it regardless, because they need it. But we need to make sure that those public funds are going to public schools. We need to make sure that we're taking care of our teachers, and we have good incentives for good teachers to work in our system and stay in our system. We need to make sure that retired teachers are taken care of. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that no matter where that school is, no matter what neighborhood that school is in, no matter what your social economic background is, that when you go to when you go get a public education, you're getting the best public education you can possibly get. And that gives you the opportunity to broaden your horizons. And it shouldn't matter what neighborhood you live in, or whether you're affluent or whether you're poor. We need to make sure that that is consistent across the board, because that is what's going to help this. And quite honestly, we have to also recognize that not every student learns the same way.
Right.
Not every student has a home life that is the same. A lot of these kids, and especially these kids that get into trouble, they don't come from a two-parent home with a brother and sister and the family dog, and they, live in the suburbs with, the 2 cars and the neighbors. That's not what their life is like. They might live with a single parent that works 2 jobs to try to keep a house over the head. They might have a younger sibling that they have to take care of. And quite honestly, they might have to go work to be able to keep a roof over their head and food on the table, depending on how old they are and where that family is in life. And we have to recognize that we can't be fining people hundreds of dollars that we know they can't pay in order to go rearrest them because they can't pay, and put them in prison, and then put them into the criminal justice system that unfortunately affects people of color a lot more than it affects people that look like me, and puts a mark on their record that makes it almost virtually impossible for them to get out of that cycle once they get put into that cycle. It just makes absolutely no sense at all.
And speaking about funding, you made so many valid points about our property taxes funding local ISDs. But if these local ISDs aren't getting that funding, then what are they going to do? It's an enormous problem. And as you said, maybe legislature in our state has been unapologetic about it. But part of the funding issue also is related to healthcare. Which takes us to our next and final topic. Medicaid and Medicare provide coverage for over 120 million people nationwide. And there's been increasing threats to cut coverage of even this in the past 2 years. And if pre-existing conditions are overturned, 130 million Americans, not even to speak of just the Texas, but 130 million Americans across the country are at risk of returning to a time when people have conditions like asthma, diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, which is common here in Texas. They could be charged more for insurance or wouldn't get coverage at all. Where do you feel that our legislature should fall on issues related to Medicaid and Medicare? And where do you feel our legislature should fall in defending protections for people with pre-existing conditions?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll talk about is one of my top priorities is Medicaid expansion in the state of Texas. It's been far too long since it needed to be done long ago, quite honestly. I mean, we're one of only 13 states in the country that hasn't expanded Medicaid. There's plenty of data out there that shows what the effects are of those states that have expanded Medicaid. And just to talk briefly about it, I already talked at the beginning that, Texas is #1 in the number of uninsured residents we have in the country. And over 4.5 million Texans have no health insurance. And that's almost 1 million children, by the way, that have no health insurance. So expanding Medicaid, what is that going to do? It's going to help. It's going to ensure or provide a means for healthcare coverage for over 1.6 million Texans. And is there a cost to that? Yes. It's going to cost Texas probably about $5.5 billion to expand Medicaid. But what is the return on investment? I'm looking at return on investment when it comes to this. And that's going to be over $65 billion from the federal government, which that's a pretty good return on investment. And what's that going to do for us? It's going to allow those rural healthcare clinics and hospitals to keep their doors open so that people that live in rural communities have access to healthcare, so they don't have to get, excuse me, get in a car and drive 4 hours to go see a doctor in a major city, or have some simple procedure done in a major city because it's just not available to them.
Right.
Uncompensated healthcare costs in our state are astronomical. So those folks that are uninsured, what happens if they get sick? Well, if they get sick, they don't go to the doctor. Then they get sicker, they still don't go to the doctor. Then they get really sick and they go, okay, now I need to go do something because they've let it go far too long. And now they go to the emergency room where they're going to get the health care they need, but they can't afford to pay for it. And they won't pay for it because they can't afford to pay for it. So somebody does pay for it, by the way, and that's us. We will pay it. So what does expanding Medicaid do? Or what will it do for the state of Texas? It'll reduce that uncompensated healthcare costs by over $35 billion. And so the overall positive that comes into the state when we see as far as revenues are concerned, the majority of states that expanded Medicaid have seen increases in their revenue at the state level because of these exact reasons I talked about. Mm-hmm. Because there's lower uncompensated healthcare costs. It costs us a small portion to get a large portion back. It keeps these rural healthcare clinics and hospitals open so that people can have access, and makes people healthier overall. Because by not doing these things, we're actually just making Texans less healthy in the long run.
And when we're healthy, we're contributing to the economy by buying things instead of just having a Netflix subscription and loathing in front of a sofa.
That's exactly right. So is expanding Medicaid the be-all answer to the healthcare problems we have in this state or in this country? No, it's not. But it's certainly a good start, and it's certainly where we need to go. And as far as like the Affordable Care Act is concerned, and this is more of the federal level that has to deal with this. I understand that. But at the end of the day, we've had the Affordable Care Act for many years. We know the things that work, and we know the things that don't. And we should be fixing the things that don't work to improve it, and then see how that goes for the next year or two, and then find the things that aren't working or not working as well and improve those things. And as we continually do that, we're going to see the healthcare that we receive and the healthcare available improve, and we're going to see the cost of healthcare go down. And by starting all over again, if we want to get rid of it and start all over again, we're going to put ourselves in the exact same position we're in now. It'll probably just be worse again and then slowly get better, as opposed to just taking what we have now and making it better. And it would, I will tell you right now, the worst thing this country could absolutely do is get rid of protections for people with pre-existing conditions. In my opinion, it's a ridiculous conversation to even be having, to even think about getting rid of protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Because look, unfortunately, what it's come down to in our healthcare industry is money, and we all know it. The pharmaceutical companies charge an astronomical amount for prescription drugs. The insurance companies charge an astronomical amount, and for many cases, garbage insurance, which is a part of the reason the Affordable Care Act was put into place, because there were so many garbage insurance policies out there that did nothing for you, that ended the ability for companies to be able to put these garbage policies on the street. And unfortunately, we're seeing with rollback and regulations in this administration that some of those policies are able to come back again, and all it does is pick off Americans.
Right. And Jay, in just about every faith tradition that's out there, providing healing, taking care of the sick, taking care of the poor, taking care of the underprivileged, taking care of people who don't have access is our duty as faithful people. It's our duty as Americans, quite frankly. I mean, the wealthiest country in the world has a healthcare system that is in absolute shambles, and it seems to get worse every year. And it's common sense to take care of the people who can't take care of themselves. It's just common sense. And it's good for our economy. It's good for our morality and our standing with God. It's good for our standing as citizens, and it's good for our standing in the world. Which takes me to our last question, which is, Jay, how does your faith, your worldview, or your moral compass inspire you and your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I was very fortunate that I had a good upbringing, and my parents and my grandparents taught me, the way to be a good person. and the way to treat people. So from day one, that's what I was taught, right? Because we all have to understand that hate is taught.
Right.
Hate is not inherent in anybody. It's taught. And I was fortunate that I was in a family that taught me the right way. And then when I joined the military, that gave me the discipline I needed. And quite frankly, it gave me the ability to travel around the world and spend time in countries, especially third world countries, where people are much less fortunate than we are here in the United States of America. You know, I always tell people the best education you can give your children is if you can afford to take them on a trip overseas to see how other people live outside of this country. It's the best education you can ever provide for your children. Because when you actually get to go experience and talk to these folks about how they live in some of these countries and realize that, you know, in some countries, you know, you're lucky if they have electricity in their house. They're lucky if they do have electricity, they might have one light. They guarantee they don't have air conditioning because they don't really have windows. It might be a cinder block hut with windows in it, but not glass windows, just windows openings in the side of the house. So it gives you an appreciation for number one, what we have here, but number two, an appreciation for humanity and being respectful to people and being able to talk to people and experiencing different cultures. And as far as my faith goes, I'm part of a church that is accepting to anybody in any walk of life, whoever they love, however they feel, they're welcome in our church. And when our pastor preaches to us and gives us the sermon based on the scriptures in the Bible, which is exactly what you talked about, because, you know, the Bible talks about taking care of those less fortunate if you are more fortunate. The Bible talks about fighting against atrocities. You know, Jesus was not the most, you know, he wasn't always this most peaceful guy. And I hear this, what would Jesus do? Usually my answer is he might flip a table, because that's what he did to fight injustice and fight tyranny. He wasn't always this guy that just said, oh, okay, that's nice. He fought for the causes for poor people because he was one. He was a peasant. He had nothing, but he gave everything to try to help people that were even less fortunate than he was. And that's what I get taught in church. And so for me, those things all combine into a position where, you know, I have an open mind. I see the world as a whole. I see the bigger picture, especially having served as an officer in the military, where you can't just laser focus on something. You have to look at the bigger picture, because sometimes the bigger picture is more important than something that's right in, you know, in a needle point right in front of you. And experiencing, you know, different cultures, it just gives you, in my opinion, it just gave me a much bigger appreciation for life as a whole and for what I have, and understanding that there's so many things bigger than me. And this is about making sure the bigger picture is taken care of, and not just focusing on, am I okay in my living room, sitting at home, and am I comfortable in my daily life? It's about, what can I do to help people that don't have or aren't as fortunate as I have been in life to have the life that I have. You know, so I do a lot of work with C3, you know, nonprofit organizations. I certainly donate a lot of my time and certainly my money to them if it's causes I believe in, because that's the way I can give back in many cases. Sometimes I can't give time, but I can give money. Sometimes I can't give money, but I can give time. So there's always a way to balance that. And for those causes that I believe in, I try to do everything I can in my power to do it.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jay. You have been so incredibly generous with your words and your time and your answers, and frankly, your honesty. I know some of my questions were a little tough, but you handled them with grace, and it sounds like these are questions, these are topics that you've been talking about for a long time. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani. I'm the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices through multi-faith and civic engagement. Today, we've been joined by Jay Sittleburg, who's running for Senate District 4 on the Democratic ticket. elections are coming up. Please give his website a visit. You can see it at the bottom of our screen. And Jay is actually the third candidate in our candidate Q&A series, which continues until the mid of October. We have also sent an invitation out to Jay's opponent, and I believe their invite is still, or their confirmation is still pending. Thank you again, Jay. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May God bless you and continue to allow you to do great work in our community.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it so much.
Have a good day.
You too.